Good morning, my name is Marina and the subject of my talk is Little Red Riding Hood, Two Different Views of the Tale. To do the presentation, first we're going to look at the authors and their context, which is a very important factor we have to bear in mind when analyzing the differences. The authors are Charles Perrault and Angela Carter. Secondly, we're going to analyze the main differences between both texts. And lastly, we're going to draw some conclusions on what are these two different views of the text trying to convince us of. Let's begin with the authors. The first author, Charles Perrault, was a French writer of the 17th century. He rewrote some fairy tales such as Cinderella, Robin Hood, or The Sleeping Beauty. As I have said, the context is very important, so let's look at it. Charles Perrault wrote under the reign of Louis XIV, under the reign of absolutism. But in his times, there were some challenging ideas who were debating the system they had. And this can be seen in the forthcoming French Revolution. The role of women was undermined. They didn't have any rights, they had to be taken care of, and they were seen as fragile. Let's turn now to Angela Carter. Angela Carter was a British writer of the 20th century. She wrote about feminism, and she mostly used the technique of magical realism. And a good example of this is her book Nights at the Circus. The text we're going to analyze is a film co-written by her and mainly based on her short story The Company of the Wolves. And this short story can be found within The Bloody Chamber, one of Carter's most famous books. Her society was very much different from that of Perrault because of the transition from feudalism to capitalism, and that is a radical change in history. She wrote under the presidency of James Callaghan in the UK, from the Labour Party, but if we look closer at Carter's time, we can see that her main direct influence was second-wave feminism. This second-wave feminism aimed at empowering women through their sexuality after centuries of oppression. Having looked at the authors and the context, it is now time to consider the texts. The first text we're going to analyze, as I have said, is the tale we all know, Little Red Riding Hood, written by Perrault. And the second text is a film co-written by Carter and directed by Neil Jordan called The Company of the Wolves. To analyze these two texts, I have divided the main differences, those three items you see in the screen, in three different categories so as to make it clearer. First of all, the image of the men. In the first text, in Perrault's text, they are seen as aggressive, as predatory, as just wanting to rape the little girl. However, in Carter's movie, men are seen as someone who can be tamed through the use of women's body. Secondly, we're going to analyze the kid, Little Red Riding Hood. In the first text, she's naive and obedient. But however, in Carter's movie, she's not that innocent. She's empowered and she's much more confident. And an illustration of this can be seen in her carrying a knife when she goes through the pass to see her grandmother. Finally, the figure of the monster or the wolf in Perrault's text is terrifying. However, in Carter's text, it is portrayed as something different, as something you don't necessarily have to be afraid of. So to summarize it, we can say that the film has a much more liberal view, and this leads us to the final part, the conclusions. In the first text, what Perrault is trying to tell girls is not to trust anyone and to be afraid. On the contrary, Angela Carter wants to empower girls, to give them confidence and to believe and take pleasure of their sexuality. Thank you very much for listening to me, and I'll be happy to answer any doubt if you have them.